Hello again, everyone. We'll continue our coverage of the Mar del Plata variation with knight e1 and bishop e3, all this super mainline stuff. We've looked at quite a few white tries already, and we'll now check out another logical looking line, the one that suffered a huge blow when Jerome Piquet was destroyed by Garry Kasparov in the line, in a very famous game that I'll refer to the model games, and you'll see it there. White is playing, again, very sensibly and thematically on the queen side. But as we've seen in this line, playing thematically isn't good enough for white. He needs to know his theory incredibly well to prevent our kingside attack crashing through. So we play all our normal moves. White again goes for the most principled, riskiest bishop e3. We gain time and space on the king side. And b4. So we just saw a4, which we dealt with by a5. This time white plays b4 to prepare c5. The issue for white with this is that if he subsequently wants to play knight d3, then he's kind of wasted a tempo, because knight d3 was getting c5 in anyway, and the pawn on b4 was not that helpful. Therefore, white's going to try playing without knight d3, but it's not really clear why you'd want to do that. So we continue, knight f6, c5, and knight g6. The usual regrouping. We're being patient. We're going to probably play h5 next to prepare g4, but we definitely want knight on g6 here. Sorry, we definitely want the knight on g6 here. And it's useful to get off the 7th rank so we can play rook f7 to control the c7 square. Remember, this is vitally important in all these lines. We want to keep this bishop on c8. Don't allow white to exchange this bishop, whatever you do. For example, rook c1, time for rook f7, because white was threatening to take on d6 and play knight b5. We're not generally that worried about losing the pawn on a7, but we're really worried about knight c7 attacking the rook on a8, followed by knight e6. So rook f7 stops that knight getting in on c7. White can grab some space, but I think we should just get on with it here. The Piquet-Kasparov game had this position, but with c-pawns already exchanged on d6. There I'm recommending we go the same way as here with h5, but Kasparov chose bishop f8, which was another good plan once the pawns are exchanged. As a rule, though, I wouldn't play bishop f8 before white has taken on d6, because here c6 and grabbing space is a bit annoying. If white's doing this, our bishop on f8 is misplaced. It's just getting in the way. So we should have got on with it with h5 instead. So we play h5. Here white has a couple of different ways to continue attacking on the queen side, but it doesn't really affect us. We're going to continue our usual stuff with g4, grabbing some space. For example, a5, g4. And we're ready to play the thematic pawn sacrifice with g3. If white starts with queen d2, then I quite like going king h7, just controlling this h6 square. We're still ready to play g3 next, but after the exchange, we'll go bishop h6. And we'll even gain a tempo this time because the queen is hit on d2. After c takes d6, we can actually throw in g3 immediately. We don't need to recapture yet because it's check when we take on f2. So we force white to take our pawn, offering, and now we can recapture. We're ready to play the usual h4 and bishop h6. Activating this bishop will be a fantastic bishop on h6 here. White can stop it, but we renew the threat. Again, we want to play bishop h6 next. Bishop drops back. Here, in fact, it's even stronger. Bishop h6 and exchange of bishops on e3 is fine, but it's even stronger to start with h4. I think you might have heard the threat let's try that again. The threat is greater than the execution. Bishop h6 is a strong idea, but let's get our knights involved first. We're going to go knight h5 when we've got some very tasty g3 and f4 squares for our knights. For example, bishop e3 to stop bishop h6, but the knight is jumping round. Now we're ready to play queen g5 and bishop h6 finally, when knight h3 check will be a huge problem for white. not only is there a fork, but the bishop on e3 is hanging. We can also just play rook g7 and increase the pressure. As usual, white's got no defense over there on the king side once that piece starts storming in. So white can capture on d6 first. We recapture. If white goes straight for it with knight b5, we continue with g4. Now white doesn't have a good way of capturing this pawn on a7. It takes with the knight g3. We saw this a couple of chapters ago. The bishop doesn't have a safe square. It doesn't have any squares. So you'd have to exchange on g3 and go bishop e3, but then we can move the knight. So knight takes d5 and queen h4, queen h2 mate. The classic mate. So taking with the knight fails. Taking with the bishop also fails because we have b6. When the bishop is trapped, we can just take it next move. And here, with so many blocked lines, okay, white's got the open c file, but nothing else. So many blocked files for the rooks, they're not really getting involved, whereas the minor pieces are fantastic here. We're just going to have 2 extra minor pieces for our attack on the king side. So white can start with a5, g4, knight e5, we continue, g3. Now, white can't actually touch this pawn. hg is very bad. fg, bishop takes. Now move order is important. We should first of all kick this knight away with a6. If you go h4, the automatic move over there, bishop f2, and then kick the knight away, unfortunately the knight doesn't need to budge. He can jump in with bishop b6, and then the knight can jump forward into c7 and annoy us. Remember, we really don't want to allow this knight into c7. So first a6, kick the knight away while the bishop is misplaced on g3, and now go h4. Next we'll play bishop h6, and then knight h5, knight gf4, queen g5, knight g3, and mate down the g file as usual. So take on g3 fails. White can try bishop takes a7 here because we don't have any b6 idea, because the pawn a5 is controlled on the square. But we can just increase the pressure with knight h7. Here, h7 is the best square for the knight because white is going to be able to exchange bishops potentially, as we'll see, at least sacrifice exchange on c8. So he's going to try closing everything up on the king side by playing rook takes c8 and h3, not allowing our classic bishop takes h3 stuff. Therefore, the only way of breaking through on the king side is going to be a knight sacrifice, and therefore we want this knight on h7 to be able to jump into g5 and take on h3. So this is the right circuit for the knight. It's a backup piece for that bishop on c8 if it gets exchanged. For example, king h1. Now white is getting ready to defend with bishop g1 to defend the pawn on h2. So we sack. Now if white takes back, automatically he's completely lost. We've kept our beautiful bishop on d7, and queen h4 is coming next, and bishop takes h3, and it'll be game over. Good night, Vienna. So white needs to counter sacrifice with rook takes c8. And this is what I meant by putting our knight on h7 here. We've lost our light square bishop, so we need to make sure that white doesn't find it so easy to close up the king side, or at least we always have a dangerous piece sacrifice in mind. We threw in queen b8 there, by the way, if I just go back, because the knight is actually quite well placed on a7. If we were to start with queen d8, then the knight on a7 has a couple benefits. One idea is that white might be able to exchange queens on c8 by putting queen c2 to c8. We don't want to support that c8 square. A second is that white has some interesting piece sacrifices with knight c6. And if we take dc, and he's got 3 connected passed pawns that are rather advanced. So first we kick this knight back. Here knight c6 isn't impressive because we can take it and take on b4. So the knight has to go back, and then we switch back to our kingside attack. Now our threat is, of course, queen h4. White will have to go h3, and then knight g5 and take on h3. So white needs to defend with h3, rook g1, and bishop f1. Now it's possible that he can hold like that, but he's playing without his rook on g1. That will never be able to move because the bishop can't move from f1. So white is just sitting and hoping that we have no way of breaking through. And probably with best play is some kind of strategic fortress draw there. But we can try and get in on the queen side, use that extra rook. And we're not running any risk. Knight sacrifices, of course, should also be kept in mind to break open white's king. White can capture immediately as well. We take. Once again, knight b5 to c7 is a big threat that we have to avoid. So always remember this rook f7. Whenever white puts a rook on c1, really, you need to make sure that knight b5 to c7 isn't a big threat. And if it is a big threat, rook f7. a4. Now, this is the move order of the Piquet Kasparov game, where bishop f8 was Caspi's choice for a fantastic win, and I urge you check out the model game. Instead, I'll just recommend h5 to be consistent, because that is our suggestion if white keeps the c pawns on the board. And so there are a lot of transpositions. And in fact, we've transposed directly into white starting with rook c1 here. Pushing forward with c6 is a typical kind of computer move. White's going for maximum space. Here we can keep it closed on the queen side with b6, a4, and a6. So we can react to b5 with a5 or a5 with b5. So keeping it nice and closed over there. Now, white's only real way of getting through is going to be to sack a piece and try and use this advanced pawn on c6. It's kind of interesting position where old computers would give white a huge advantage because of this extra space on the queen side. But it's actually of very limited value. And our attack on the king side is coming, as always. Therefore, g4 is what they're trying in correspondence, slowing up our attack over there. Now, it's possible that keeping it all closed is some kind of draw, although it's rather risky. White can bring all this piece over to the queen side and eventually sack something on b6 or d6, open up lines. And we're not trying to just suffer for a draw with the king's Indian anyway. So let's play en passant to keep some open lines. h8 and knight h5. Here, our main plan is to play queen f6 and try and get in g4, maybe knight back to e7, queen g6, and g4 to open up lines. But an additional plan, if white is a bit careless, can be seen after knight d3. White should probably play king h2, and then we'll go queen f6 and play for the g4 plan. But here we can open up lines with a nice piece sacrifice with knight gf4. So this knight jump into f4 is very dangerous. We're opening up the g file and just opening up lines to this bare king. It kind of has to be taken, though. If white declines it, then we've got a few different plans, but knight h3 check, getting rid of the bishop on f2 is very tempting, as is some queen f6 and knight takes e2 when the pawn on f3 is vulnerable. The bishop is also coming in on h3. So white takes, we take, and here white needs to choose where to put his king. Choose wisely, and actually I think it's impossible to figure out over the board which is a better square. The king does need to move because the threat is queen g5 check. Rook e1 isn't in time because queen g5, king f1, bishop h3 is mate. And in fact, the king needs to go into the corner with h1, allowing knight g3 with check if necessary. But this is the only way for the rook to get involved. For example, queen g5, rook g1, play the check, capture. Now white needs to run with the king desperately. Our threat is queen h4 check, bishop h3 check, and bishop f1 mate, or directly queen h4 and queen h3 mate. So the king runs. Let's get some more attackers involved. These two connect fast pawns are very dangerous. Now white wants to exchange queens. Clearly we don't want that happening. So let's keep the cage closed with the rook f4. A nice pretty move, offering the exchange, but there are very limited open files for the rooks. Once white takes it, he will actually have an entire extra rook for just one pawn. But even though there's a lot of space on the queen side, there are no open lines for the rooks. So the h file is the only potential open file, and we own that at the moment. So we're not worried. when the rook is taken, e takes, and our bishop is fantastic on the long diagonal. In the game that we're following, correspondence game, black put his king on e7 and then pushed the h-pawn, and black was soon in the ascendancy. White managed to grovel a draw, but it's in fact an incredibly difficult position for white. He's got no active plan. He might have an extra rook, but he can't do anything with it, and we can just slowly improve and get ready to crash through on the king side. I think in a practical game, reaching this position, white is more likely to go king h2, so that knight g3 doesn't come with check. This is actually a big mistake. The point is now that after knight g3, bishop takes, we have the beautiful not f takes g3, when the white's king would start running back into the center, but queen g5. Now, despite the extra 2 knights, white's lost here. He can't get his king back to safety. Even this extra bishop on g3 is not helping. If the bishop drops back, then we're going to mate with rook f6 to h6. Simple lawnmower mate, I believe it's called. I could try defending the bishop like this, but of course we're not taking it yet. We're ready to go rook h6 check, and queen takes g3, and bishop h3 mate. White controls the h3 square, but rook g6. We're ready to take on g3 with the pawn. We don't need to rush anything in this line, despite being 2 pieces down, because white just can't coordinate his pieces. Instead, we can just slowly build our pieces up into the attack and just make sure white's king can't run. Queen e1 is the most tenacious defense. Obviously, we don't want to take that because it will allow the queen to take on g3, because the queen will now get involved. Instead, we have a very cunning check. Queen h6. Now, h6 is a better square than h5 for a very subtle reason that we'll see in a few moves' time. The chance of actually getting this position, I hasten to add, is very low, but it's worth seeing some themes that hopefully can be employed in your games. If white blocks with bishop h4, bishop f6, here we'll see the reason why h6 is a better square than h5 for our queen. If the queen were on h5, white would be able to defend with check and rook g4. With point after take, our queen would be attacked on h5, and we'd have to play queen takes h4, exchanging off the queens. We've managed to win a rook, but still, it's rook and pawn for 2 knights, and white is going to be fine. It should just be equal. But here, of course, our queen isn't attacked, so we can take with the bishop, keep the queens on the board, and it's game over. We've got f3 and bishop g3. So the defense doesn't work if our queen is on h6. White can try running, and we can still ignore that bishop, bishop h3. A big problem for white, if we don't take on g3, is that the queen on e1 is really in the way. White would desperately want to play king f2 to e1, run into the center, but he can't because his own pieces are in the way. Queen f2, and we still decline that bishop. White's king is still stuck. The bishop actually can't move anymore because bishop h2 runs into bishop h4 and the queen is trapped. And so white can't move here. We're probably going to play king h8 next, bring this rook into the game with rook g8 and rook takes g3. All our pieces are attacking, and those extra couple of knights are useless. It's game over. So that was the computer style c6, going for maximum space but closing up the queen side. Knight d3 has been played, but I mentioned this right at the start of this video, that it doesn't actually make any sense, because white could have had this position with the pawn back on b2 and white to move if he'd started with knight d3 instead of b4. And it's not actually clear how b4 is helping. The only point of b4 was to prepare c5. So we do our normal stuff with h5. If white now switches back to rook c1, of course we would play rook f7. We don't allow the knight in. But again, we're kind of just a tempo up on the line. We saw already that our attack was crashing through in the main lines, and it was incredibly risky for white. Giving us an extra tempo is just a death wish. So white can try closing it, but here we can even just take because we're getting g4 in so fast. The knight on d3 is getting in the way of white's control of the d5 square. This is similar to the main line, but a better version for us. a4 is turned into the main way of playing this position. White's gaining space, and we'll see a major point of it is he wants to play c6. Now, the immediate c6, we could keep everything closed with b6, and followed by a6. But here we don't have time to play both moves. We don't want to play a6 here because white might switch plan and exploit our weak b6 square with some cd and a5. So we're going to leave the queenside b. But that means that at least with c6, b6, a5, and white opens the queenside. So that is the real point behind a4. But we don't need to worry too much about his point because we're just going to attack on the kingside. So c6 is the only really logical continuation here. Everything else is much too slow. a5, going for space, but every tempo is vital. White can't afford just to play vague, aggressive-looking moves with a4, a5, and b4. That's 3 tempi spent to grab a space. We spent those 3 tempi to play g5, h5, and g4. Already g3 is a huge threat. White has tried this in correspondence, but I don't think he'll be trying it anytime soon with the stronger engines out there now. a6, we just play b6. Now this is a fun line. White's play is maximalistic. He wants to play bishop c6, attacking our rook. And when our rook moves, knight b5, take the pawn on a7, move the knight back, play a7 and queen. So that's bishop c6, knight b5, knight takes a7, knight back, a7, 5 tempi, and white is completely winning. But we can use those tempi ourselves rather efficiently. Here, though, I think we should pay special attention and take on c5 first. That's because if we play the automatic g3, white can make it a bit tricky with bishop c6. I think this should be playable for black, but white's having some fun here. He sacrifices the bishop to kickstart his plan of taking on a7. It's much better to have these pawns exchanged because now we've got an open b file. And in the worst case, we can just sacrifice the rook for the knight when it lands on b5 now, without the b pawns in the way. So white takes this pawn. We continue. And now the bishop has a dilemma. It can go back to h2, but that loses control of the center. So we have time to go bishop h6. In general, this is a useful antidote to the bishop dropping back to h2. The bishop is going to be uncontested on this diagonal now, and e3 is a very strong square, as well, of course, as the usual plan of knight h5. Therefore, the bishop should probably drop back to f2 to keep an eye on the e3 square, but now white is not fighting for the f4 square. So knight h5 and the normal stuff is happening. Our rook is attacked. And swap, and bishop takes a7 is really the only logical continuation. In a fairly recent correspondence game, they got this far, and then white realized that actually the whole thing didn't work. And so he tried rook a2, but simply knight g3. Taking a7 now allows h3. We've got some pretty ideas of taking on f1 and h2 in either move order. So the pawn needs to be taken. Now we come in with knight f4. It's a theme of this line. We ignore our rook on b8 now. We ignore this queenside rook. It wasn't helping in our attack, so we don't need it. Now our 2 knights are going to be joined by the bishop on c8 and queen, and the attack is overwhelming. We don't need this rook. Queen g5, knight takes h3, bishop takes h3. Discovered checks with the knight on g3. It's just all too much for white. So take on a7, and again we ignore our rook with h3. Take the rook. So white's, this is a kind of the essence of the King's Indian boiled down into a single position, at least these Mar del Plata variations. White has broken through on the queen side. There's no denying it. He's one material, and he's 2 tempi away from queening his pawn. All that looks like he's completely winning. But his king is extremely vulnerable. Our attack comes first, and here with h2 check, gaining some more time. White can't hide behind the pawn here, because knight g3 check is going to come with tempo and queen h4 check. So he's taking, check. Bishop h6, we're threatening to mate with bishop e3 check. So that he's dealing with. So white can try f4. This is kind of a thematic counter in these structures to try and get the rook involved on f1 and the knight on e1 to try and get them to defend too. But we can just take. That gives back the exchange, but our attack is still too strong. One threat is knight g3 followed by a mate with queen h1, knight e2 check and queen h1. And another idea can be seen after a7. Our pawn's getting so close to queening, but check and checkmate. Bad luck, white. You're so close. So that is a very direct line, worth remembering, because if you get something a bit wrong there, then white will queen his pawn. But it's worth knowing that objectively, the line is extremely good for us. White can exchange too, and this has been played often, but I think it's probably white players getting muddled up. We play our normal g3, and the theoretical position is with the rook on c1 and rook on f7, which is a huge improvement for white because he has the exchange sacrifice with rook takes c8. Here, there's no way of getting rid of our beautiful bishop on c8, and therefore white's getting mated. You can see a couple of ideas. hg. Let's kick that knight back again first while the bishop is misplaced on g3. So the bishop, there's no annoying bishop f2 to b6 and knight jump into c7. Now we play h4 and knight h5. This game was between two strong grandmasters. Black was Smirin, who is King's Indian specialist. I urge you to check out his games if you want some inspiration from the King's Indian. He's played lots of fantastic games. And white was another strong grandmaster for Tatnik. Here he realized quite how bad his position had become. Our pieces are just storming into the attack. One knight's jumping into f4, the other into g3, queen g5. We've seen this a few times. So he tried f4. We've just seen this idea opening up the bishop on e2 and knight on e1, rook on f1. They're all terrible. So it's good to give up a pawn to activate these pieces. Smirin took the pawn and went on to win with a very nice position. But it's actually even stronger just to play knight g3. We ignore the pawn. The second knight wants to come to this f4 square. And white's just defenseless. He can't compete against all our pieces flowing into the game. Note how he's got absolutely nowhere on the queen side here. And already our attack has crashed through. So that is h takes g3. The other try is bishop takes a7 in analogy with the main line, where the rooks would be on c1 and f7. But here the problem is, after knight h7, king h1, the same line, bishop's coming to g1. I can imagine some opponents, book-type opponents, blitzing to this point. We go rook takes a7, and then we go, oh yeah, and I sack, oh wait, my rook isn't on c1 yet. I can't sacrifice back on c8. And after the rook is taken, here is our mate. Bishop takes h3 next. You can see quite how much white needs to know not to get mated in the opening in these lines. So that was a5, which is too slow. Rook c1. We can play g4 first. The knight isn't yet coming into c7. And this time, in fact, we don't need to even play rook f7 because g3 comes fast enough for attacking the bishop, so white hasn't had time to play knight c7. And we've just gained time on the usual race. h3 is possible. I think I might have made my feelings known about this move already earlier in the video. It's extremely risky. White is taking everything on stopping g4, but when it comes, even as the pawn sacrifice, we're opening up everything towards white's king. So it's super, super risky. Here we can just play g4 immediately. After the exchange, bishop h6, we're going to get this rook on f8 into the game, either with king g7, rook h8, or rook f7 to h7, or to g7, and put a lot of pressure on this pawn on g4, and also ideas of putting a piece on h4, for example, bishop g5 to h4. White's going to have to be extremely accurate to survive this position. I think it's already extremely unpleasant. So the main line is to play c6. This is the most coherent strategy with the pawn on a4 already. The point is that we can't play b6 because a5 anyway, and we're not in time to play a6 as well, so that we could react to a5 with b5. So the queenside is being opened. So therefore, it's better to take, and let's just control some of those useful central squares with bishop e6. Keep our king safe on the long diagonal. Now, this position has been reached a lot in correspondence chess, but almost not at all in human chess. This plan of a4 c6 is quite a recent approach. So I think this is probably as far as you need to know, but it's useful to know a couple of the plans that your opponent might adopt here. It's worth saying that if white is slow, we're just going to get on with it with g4, g3, and the usual attack. It's extremely, extremely scary. The most critical move is to play bishop a6 and try and get somewhere with bishop b7, bishop takes a7, and attack. It's the only kind of scary move. The most common move is actually bishop d3, which is incredibly slow. The idea is that we've got such a good bishop on e6, white wants to exchange it off with bishop c2 to b3. But this is a lot of tempi, and we can just get on with it on the king side. g4, c2, white's consistent at g3, we can be consistent too, and h4. And again, white has this conundrum about where to put the bishop back to. If he goes to h2, he's losing control of the e3 square, so bishop h6, bishop's ready to land in on e3. We also have ideas of exchanging these bishops with bishop f4, followed by taking with the knight when the g3 square is a huge weakness. So probably after h4, the bishop should go to f2, but then knight h5, and we're ready to play queen into g5 and knight gf4 and attack this way. So I think that bishop d3 is just too slow. Bishop a6 is at least a bit scarier, but again, we can continue with g4. White could switch back to the plan of exchanging bishops with queen d3, the idea of bishop back to c4, but we just ignore it. g3, get on with our plan again. The themes are very similar to what we just saw. This time a knight is going to land on f4 with tempo as well. Bishop b7 goes after our rook. We'll continue attacking, g3 and h4. This time let's move the rook once, but only to deflect the bishop from f2. He takes our pawn, and now knight h5. You want our rook? And this has been played a fair bit in correspondence. I found 7 correspondence games with 6 draws and 1 black win. But from a practical point of view, I think it's much easier for us. The problem for white is he's won the exchange, but his dark square bishop was an incredibly important piece. And now this king is just so vulnerable along the a7 to g1 diagonal. We'll go queen a7 check, and the g3 square and f4 square, ready to play bishop h6 and activate this bishop too. There are so many holes in white's position. His bishop on b7 looks pretty, but it's not actually contributing anything. And our knights can get in. Our attack just is flowing. One line where white tries to queen his extra pawn, just show how slow it is. Pawn can get to a6, but bishop e3 check, and our knights come in. Our queen can join via d8 and back to g5, when queen g3 is going to be mating as well. There's no defense. Once again, we see that white needs to be incredibly accurate in all of these lines to avoid being mated, whereas we can be just quite consistent. I hope I've shown that our plan is logical. We need, of course, rook f7 to stop a knight jumping into c7, but the plan is g4, g3, sacrifice this pawn to open up lines towards white's king and give our minor pieces over on the king side fantastic outposts. Thanks for watching. Cheers.